basically started from the premise that I believe that anti-Semitism was first and foremost like a cancer, that it has a tendency to spread like a tumor. And second of all, that it's usually a symptom of a deeper crisis, of a deeper, or sort of, let's call it the crisis of liberal democracy.
Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Decency. So please, as always, remember to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or to leave us a 5-star rating on the podcasting platform of your choice. This is also the last episode of 2020. It's been a great adventure, but do not worry, this is not the end. We will be back next January, so stay tuned and we will be back.
Now, for this episode, an old spectre is haunting Europe. In fact, it's as old as Europe itself, but has been channeled in so many different forms that the latest ones become harder to identify each time. Now, the recent Islamist attack that we saw at a synagogue in Vienna is only the latest example, but the number of anti-Semitic incidents and attacks across Europe has been exploding for a while. Countries like Austria, Sweden, or even Germany are only recently waking up to this new worrying phenomenon, whereas other countries like France, where we're based, have been in its throes since the early 2000s.
So what's different about this time's new anti-Semitic wave? Who are the perpetrators? What motivates them? So to cover all these questions, we are very happy, we're delighted actually, to be joined by two leading experts on the field. One in academia and the other one in advocacy. So please remember, leave us a positive rating and review. It would be a great Christmas treat, under the pine tree, and it really helps us grow the show. Now, enjoy the episode.
Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Decency, and thank you so much for joining us. Today we are delighted to be joined by two leading figures in both the study and the fight against an old spectre that is again hunting Europe. A lot of our listeners will be aware on both sides of the pond of the ongoing spike in anti-Semitic sentiment across many countries in Europe. Hopefully we'll get to talk about the United States to some extent as well, but we're extremely pleased to be joined by Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, who is the Director for Europe of the American Jewish Committee, the AJC, which is, as our folks on the American side of the pond will know, the world's largest Jewish advocacy organization that does tremendous work and really important work advocating and informing and educating around the threat of anti-Semitism. So we're very thankful for her for joining us. She's based in Paris and she handles all of AJC's European work across the continent. And then on the other side of the pond, we're also very pleased to be joined by Günther Jikeli. Professor Jikeli is a distinguished historian and an academic who teaches at Indiana University in Bloomington. He is the Erna B. Rosenfeld Professor at the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism at Indiana University. So that's also incredibly germane, the work you do, Professor, to the kind of issues that we want to bring up with the both of you today. And so we're really grateful that you were able to join us. And I wanted to start with something of a general question to sort of get the ball rolling here. There's a lot of people in our audience will be vaguely aware of what we're talking about when we mean anti-Semitism and the recent spike, the return of anti-Semitism to our politics, to our culture. But if you had to give a sort of a general overview of what this recent spike looks like, how you've your work on it, how you would describe it to someone who maybe isn't so much aware, who doesn't really get their news from sources that do cover these things. So kind of give us a rundown here of what the threat is these days, and maybe starting with Simone, and then we'll head over.
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for having me on. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. But really, anti-Semitism, I would say, is not as recent as one might think. In France, in particular, where I think it became sort of the most obvious. It really started in the very beginning of the early years of 2000. When you compare, for example, the anti-Semitic acts, meaning violence, hate crimes against Jews with the late 90s and the early 2000s, there is a pretty dramatic rise. You would have about 87, 88 anti-Semitic acts a year in the late 90s, and then you jump basically to the year 2000, 2001, and you would have 350 acts a year. Now that basically means, more or less on average one a day, and this for a population which in France represents less than 1% of the total of French people, meaning 1%. Also, you know, there have been many people who have been killed. The first one was Ilan Halimi in 2006. Since then, we've had numerous anti-Semitic murders, and this phenomenon has really sort of spread across much of the Western European continent, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, and then in a different extent, I would say, in less violence, but nevertheless anti-Semitism, to Central and Eastern Europe. So this is basically sort of the situation today. When you look at the numbers, it's pretty clear whether there are the FRA numbers from the Fundamental Rights Agency looking at Jewish sentiment, where Jews describe a huge amount of anxiety, whether it's about the fact that Jews have left a part of the European continent. That's definitely the case in France, where Jews decided to leave in the last 10 years, in particular, to Israel, where Jews have decided to leave to different areas because it's becoming too dangerous. So all of this basically creates a situation where basically the European continent is very much affected by anti-Semitism, and Jews are afraid. There's a sentiment of loneliness and fear.
Yes, I mean, I can confirm this from all the factors that we can look at. So if we look at statistics that Simone mentioned, if we look at surveys interviewing Jews about their experiences of anti-Semitism, the most recent such survey says that 39% of the respondents, Jewish respondents, experienced personally a form of anti-Semitic harassment in the last 5 years. So these are huge numbers. Unfortunately, we see also in the United States some of this development. In the United States, these figures are that they become personally target of anti-Semitic remarks in person, 23%. There was a survey from last year. So this we have, and we have also in the public discourse. What I observe is that it has become more central among some politicians, that we hear some anti-Semitic remarks more often. So Daniel Dayan, he has talked about a kind of spiraling dynamic of anti-Semitism, and I think that makes it really dangerous. You have it on a number of levels, and the violence in words and in acts is increasing. So we have seen that also when in the early 2000s there was a lot of anti-Semitic violence on streets in connection to anti-Semitic rallies. They were labeled as pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel rallies, and within these, or often after these rallies, there were then attacks on synagogues or other Jewish institutions, and that has now spread far beyond like being triggered by anything related to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So it's more widespread, and we have the violence that we have in form of terrorism has certainly increased in the past 2 decades. So we have a number of indicators that show us that we're certainly in a wave of anti-Semitism in different forms, and different perpetrators, they express their anti-Semitism very differently. But yeah, we see this wave, and unfortunately, we see some of the early developments we saw in Europe now also in the United States and in Canada in somewhat different forms, but we certainly have an increase there as well that translate into a feeling of insecurity among Jewish communities. That's first noticed. So even here in this little community in Bloomington, they are now closing the doors and talking about security measures where forever they had just an open door policy. And this is across the country. This is a development, of course, that in Europe for many, many years, synagogues had to be protected in some form. This is nothing new for communities in Europe. But yes, we see an increase in that, in the threat in Europe, as we've seen in Germany in the attack last year in Halle. But we see it also globally, that there's an increased threat against Jewish communities worldwide.
If I may just follow up very, very quickly on this, it's really interesting. I think what Günther just said, because I remember a time, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, the very famous journalist from the Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, did a piece on anti-Semitism in Europe. And at the time, he came to France, and he went to Sweden and to Germany, to a few other countries, and basically came to the conclusion that Jews didn't have really a future in Europe because the situation was so terrible. And I remember I at the time had a conversation with him where I said to him, are you so sure that the problem of anti-Semitism will not spread elsewhere? Because I basically started from the premise that I believe that anti-Semitism was first and foremost like a cancer, that it has a tendency to spread like a tumor. And second of all, that it's usually a symptom of a deeper crisis, of a deeper, or sort of, let's call it the crisis of liberal democracy. Um, and I think when I asked the question at the time, he probably thought I was crazy. When you fast forward, 5, 6 years, it's very apparent now that that the cancer has indeed been spreading. I mean, we're not talking about anti-Semitic incidents just in Paris and Brussels and Copenhagen, but we are talking about Pittsburgh, we're talking about San Diego, we're talking about incidents in universities, on campuses, in New York, and in Los Angeles, in Boston, everywhere. And so it's very, very clear, I think, that this disease, or whatever you want to call it, or this virus, it's very contemporary, is sort of very clearly spreading.
Well, this is all incredibly useful, you both, and I would just direct folks to a really interesting essay that you had, Simone, back in the day at the Atlantic, which was drawing lessons from what Europe had been undergoing for years. And as you said, one of the interesting points from your response there was that in countries like France, this really traces back to the early 2000s. It's by no means a novel phenomenon, but it spreads at different speeds, it seems like, right? I mean, a country like Austria, where they've just had a really horrible attack on a synagogue, they may have been less, or it may have been less of a metastasized sentiment, and the lessons that we can learn from how countries like France have been dealing with it are really important, and they need to be exported and shared with the states, which was, as I understand it, the purpose of your piece there. But I wanted to turn to something of a more specific question. I mean, there was so much that was just said by you both, a lot to unpack. Obviously, the ways that anti-Semitism is now also kind of permeating our politics, and we can even get into some of the scandals that political parties in the continent have seen themselves enmeshed in terms of anti-Semitism, but also the way that the Palestinian Israeli conflict still plays to a large extent in this issue. Professor Jikeli, I wanted to start with you because you've got a very interesting piece of research that you did, I believe, recently, where you carried perhaps the largest number of interviews on this issue that anyone has ever done. You've been in Berlin, Paris, London, where you've interviewed particularly Muslim youths. It was your focus for that study, and you and I also discussed the work of Marc El-Kaldous, right, the Belgian sociologist who did a somewhat similar work in 2011 in the Brussels school system. So my question is, it seems like this phenomenon of anti-Semitism really is has really spread massively among communities of Muslim faith, and it makes the issue so much harder to tackle, doesn't it? Because it seems like you're pitting two communities of faith against one another, and it makes it all the more almost like it makes it very sensitive, right? It's a very sensitive issue. So I wonder, maybe can you, Professor, can you give us a little more detail on what your study showed and how you see this, and what you see the connection there between these communities of Muslim faith and anti-Semitism, or do you think there's perhaps something even deeper at work that transcends differences of faith?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when we talk about this, and I think that if we look at back to the numbers of the worst, if you want, the worst anti-Semitic incidents, where Jews were murdered for being Jewish, and since the 21st century there were I counted 33 of such murders, and that includes in the United States and in Europe, and in Europe mostly in France. And in France, all of these, the perpetrators were jihadists. In the United States, they were mostly white nationalists. But so you have clearly this threat of jihadist Muslims who attack primarily, or one of the main targets are Jews and Jewish institutions, and we have seen that in the terror attacks. So, of course, then there is the question: what about the Muslim communities in the European countries? And in some countries, we have large Muslim communities in France, in Germany, and in Britain, mostly. There are larger Muslim communities. Of course, those Muslim communities, only a tiny fraction are jihadists, so and or even Islamists, who would be maybe not take violent measures, but this is still a minority of the Muslim communities. But what I was interested in, so I did field studies in Berlin, in London, and in Paris, but that's some years back, where I just went on the streets and asked mostly young people about their attitudes of Jews, and also their experiences of their own experience of racism. And so I spoke to many Muslims there between the age of 16 and 27. And I found a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes that some of them you can find also in the non-Muslim population, and some of it is specific. So we have a long history of Christian anti-Semitism, but also of Islamic anti-Semitism. And so I always say that there are at least 5 main factors that lead to the situation that today in Muslim communities, in Europe, but around the world, that there is a high level of Jew hatred. And so this goes back to Islamic sacred texts that can be easily interpreted, some of them, some parts of it, as hating against Jews or saying that Jews are the enemies of Muslims. Then there is an Islamic history of hundreds of years where Jews were discriminated. They didn't have the same status, and they were looked down upon. Then we have Christian exports in the 19th century with colonialism and missionaries. Most famous case, the Damascus blood libel, that is now, that is still, we still have one of the ministers in Syria. He published in the 80s a book about it. He was, and he is still, these kind of literature is still widely read. And then we had political Islam, of course, with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who pushed an anti-Semitic worldview that was something that is something new in the, or at the time was something new in the Islamic world, blaming Jews basically for war against Muslims. We have even today, we have the leader Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who was preacher on Al Jazeera and heads the European Council for Fatwa and Research. He believes that Hitler was sent as the divine punishment for the Jews and advocates for another Holocaust. So, and he explicitly said, I think that it was in 2009, God willing, the next time this punishment will be inflicted by the hand of the faithful, which he means the Muslims. So you had this, then you had the Nazi propaganda that was pushing this fusion of anti-Jewish sentiment in Islam with the with global conspiracy theories about world Jewry, and on top of that they had Pan-Arabism that united. One of the main focus point was their hatred against Israel, saying that because there is Israel, we cannot unite as a big Arab country in unity. So all these 5 factors have led from different directions, if you want, to a situation that today in many Muslim countries and also then in many Muslim families, the word Jew is used as an insult, and that there is a norm of anti-Semitism, and that many have this understanding that Muslims and Jews are forever enemies. Of course, this is wrong, and we have many counterexamples that show, well, of course, Muslims and Jews can be perfectly friends, and we see an encouraging development now in the Middle East, most recently with Morocco. But even, this is not only like since yesterday, literally, but I have Moroccan friends who are Muslim and who visited Israel together with me, some 10 years back almost. So we do have also, of course, these counterexamples, but all these 5 factors that I just mentioned, they have led to a situation that is very difficult to overcome these kind of stereotypes. So we have seen that in the interviews that we did, and we've seen that now in interviews we're doing with Syrians in Germany who came in 2014-15 to Germany. We're currently doing a 3rd wave of interviews to see what has changed after 5 years being in the country. So we're much looking forward to see the results there. But this is one of the problems there. And then you have these Islamist organizations. They're also active in Europe, and they radicalize some of the Muslim views with some of these baggage that might be there from some of these influences, and point out that, for example, some verses in the Quran would prove that the Jews are the enemies, and get then even are able to convince enough people to make it a threat, a specific threat for Jewish communities also in Europe. But of course, we also, this is in a context where we also see the radical right rising, and in some countries the populist right. So it's not they're not the only perpetrators and the only threat. that Jewish communities face in Europe.
And Simon, your work obviously focuses on advocating and educating people. Is the issue of to what extent these? I mean, again, it seems, although not confined to it, it seems largely concentrated around communities of Muslim faith. Is that being a hurdle in your work across Europe?
Yeah, no. First of all, I would say I think Günther's work and the academic work that has been done to really look at this issue and sort of identify the sources of anti-Semitism, including Muslim anti-Semitism, is absolutely key, because I think for a very long time one of the problems was that it was extremely difficult to even address the issue. And to some extent for good reasons. I mean, I would say good sentiment. The fact that I think many politicians didn't want to look at an issue, speak about a community that in their minds, and probably rightfully so actually, was subject to racism and discrimination themselves, and so didn't want to create a situation where another minority group would be identified as being problematic or the culprit. uh, and so for a very, very, very long time, really, I would say, nearly 10 to 15 years, it was extremely difficult to even address the issue. And sometimes, to some extent, it continues to be complicated. Um, and so to have research that allows you to identify clearly the sources, not just the far right, because this one is relatively easy to talk on, not just the far right, but also by the way, the far left, maybe we'll speak about this later on, but also Muslim, and sort of get a better understanding of where the sources come from, what the component is, I think is absolutely key. And when I think of the words that were often used in French language, and the French have a facility to invent new words, like the importation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or intercommunal tension, as if there were sort of some sort of bizarre equal fights going on between Jews and Muslims on French soil, just to find a way to avoid basically speaking about the fact that Jews were being attacked, yes, by a minority group that itself is suffering from racism and discrimination, but doesn't exempt parts of that minority group of being problematic. So yes, it was extremely complicated to talk about, and again, these studies, I think, are absolutely clear. I think the other thing is that for many years people used to believe that basically, if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would disappear, if there was peace between Israel and the Palestinians, the anti-Semitism would go away. That there was a direct link between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and anti-Semitism in Europe. And I think to a great extent that has proven itself to be wrong. Yes, it is linked. I mean, that's very clear. When you have an incident, when you have, I don't know, in 2014, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, it absolutely directly produces violence in the streets of Paris and elsewhere. But it's not only that. I mean, when you look, for example, at the fact that the murders committed by Mohamed Merah in 2012 by Jewish school children and a teacher itself produced 90 anti-Semitic acts in a very short period of time, as if people considered this to be a heroic incident that needs to be copied. It sort of proves that it's totally disconnected from the Israeli-Palestinian. It is to some extent disconnected from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or at least it is structural, and it's structural itself.
If I may jump in there, so I think it can be relatively easily explained if you think of anti-Semitism as being a mindset in some people, and they get that is just there in their thinking, but they do not necessarily act on that. but they act when they have trigger moments. So one of these trigger events, when people get triggered, is when they think that um, Israel is an evil state. That they, maybe that is a premise already, but that Israel is now acting, and there's an urgency to do something against this. So then this is just a trigger moment for many people to act in anti-Semitic ways, and this kind of used also as an excuse by the perpetrators, but even more importantly, I think by others who who get let people get away with this kind of argument. I mean, we have seen this is also nothing new. I mean, one of the most powerful accusations against Jews that had led to a lot of violence is this blood libel. And if you really believe that Jews would abduct children to use their blood in rituals, I mean, this is really evil. So if you if there are then rumors going around like this, then this is a trigger moment for people to act on this. And this is similar in a modernist way. We can see that with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is for most people really far away, and they don't know much about it. But they have this image of Israel or Zionism in their head that has not much to do with reality, and it's very similar to the image that some centuries ago people had of Jews in their head without knowing much about Judaism or Jews.
Right, because I had a question which I think Simon touched a little bit about was the politics of anti-Semitism, because historically, well, at least in the 20th century, anti-Semitism was quite clearly associated with far right. But I think something which we've seen over the past generation or so is it has taken a slightly different political color, which also makes the issue complicated to talk about, because it's no longer the far right we're talking about. It's also about elements of the far left. Why is it the far left? It's a complicated question, but we've seen the other day the controversy about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party in the UK around Jeremy Corbyn. We see a lot of elements of people coming from the anti-Zionist left ending up platforming people who are flat out anti-Semitic. So how did we end up here? Is it the old tradition of anti-Zionism, and that comes with the association with the Soviet Union and promotion of anti-Zionism worldwide, or is there something deeper? Maybe we're going back to the kind of perennial anti-capitalist facet of anti-Semitism. How do we explain that the anti-Semitic virus has been spreading among ranks of some parties on the far left the past generation or so?
So yeah, as you say, I would say it's all of the above. It's really, I think it's a product of it. First of all, it is complex. It's multiple reasons. It's a product, I think, of a long history, which goes back to Bruno Bauer, who maintained that the Jews could only politically be emancipated from the day when they emancipated themselves from religion, or August Bebel, who was a German politician who spoke of anti-Semitism as a socialism for food. Or even when you look at the Dreyfus affair, much of the left in France was pretty ambiguous, seeing through the affair sort of a struggle among the elites, and then of course the issue of the Stalinists, who were who are not outdone in their hatred of the Jews, and who identified them with, capitalism, imperialism, and kept repeating that Israel was sort of, an apartheid imperialist state. When you look at, the caricatures even back then, which were clearly, where you could clearly sort of understand the link of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism today. And so I think today that there is a leftist anti-Semitism that is sort of a furious detestation of Israel, where basically Israel is sort of become sort of is nearly excluded from humanity to some extent, and where you sort of have really a sort of a very unreasonable, very emotional hostility towards Israel. Um, and when you look at some of the whether it's Jeremy Corbyn or Jean-Luc Mélenchon, And there are some very old sort of anti-Semitic stereotypes that are used that you would actually think that they come from the far right. The issue of control, of manipulation. I remember when Jeremy Corbyn lost the election, when the Labour Party lost the election, Jean-Luc Mélenchon here said that all of this was because of the Likud and of the chief rabbi of Britain, who basically, manipulated British opinion and was basically responsible for Jeremy Corbyn's failure. And on the other hand, for example, someone like Ilhan Omar, even in the United States, she speaks about, it's all about the Benjamins. That the reason why there is a support for Israel is basically all because of Jewish money. That's what it means. So it's actually old, sort of typical stereotypes, anti-Semitic stereotypes that persist throughout the ages and that have deep roots, I think, in parts of the left.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that, I think that's all well said. With there is also a certain demise of the left that we've witnessed intellectually, and that has led to a situation that large parts of the left have now a kind of, it's more like a cultural left, I would say, that is not really embedded in much theory than a very simplified vision of what we can read in Mao or Che Guevara's text that make everything that divide the world into oppressors and oppressed, a very binary um, um, worldview, and not in like classes, economic classes, but in oppressed peoples and oppressor peoples. And then also going further in that with identity politics, um, talking about oppressed um, minorities and oppressive majorities, and always seeing the world in this perspective. And then Jews, of course, they don't fit in there. So um, because then Jews are usually then put in the category of oppressors. So that's another development that we've seen. Um, I think with this really demise of the left that don't have good answers to the problem that we face today in the world. And also another development, of course, is that um, if you look at anti-Semitism historically, it has usually been around um, important questions, topics of the respective era. So, and it has been formulated in that way. And often, the way I see it, it's often rather um, an indicator of the disease of it. But today, one of the let's say after the Second World War and after the Holocaust, um, we have come into an area where human rights are very important, and and racism is as an important issue that should be addressed, and I think that's rightly so. Um, but this is how the way that is addressed then, and if um, you have still problems both with racism, I would argue less so than 50 years ago, but still, and with human rights certainly around the world, they're huge issues, and this cannot be resolved easily. Um, and then there is a tendency among some um, to blame Jews for why this is not going forward. And this is then in the left, they identify then Jews or the Jewish state as being responsible or being the worst perpetrators of white supremacism and racism and colonialism and all the ills of that we contemporaries see as the ills of the world. So we have this development as well in the left, and that was a fringe opinion in the 60s. Until very recently, it was a fringe opinion. This anti-imperialist view that was always there in the left, but that was rather on the fringes, and that has now drifted much more into mainstream.
So I thought what Simon said about the Dreyfus affair was very interesting, because one of the reasons the left was divided on this is, for a lot of intellectuals on the left, this was not their issue. This was a bourgeois affair among the rich, which we shouldn't be talking about. And I think to some extent, there's a little bit of that nowadays among, the identity politics activists on the left, which is they have this kind of hierarchy of oppressed and oppressors and whatnot, and they're very uncomfortable where they should locate the Jews in that kind of hierarchy. The other day we had the communist activist Ash Sakar. For those who don't know Ash Sakar, she's famous for going on Piers Morgan and telling Piers Morgan, "I'm literally a communist, you idiot." But she has a good following in the UK, and she argued the other day that anti-Semitism is not tied to systemic disadvantage in either the jobs market or the criminal justice system. Therefore, anti-Semitism isn't exactly a form of racism. So you could really see that she wasn't comfortable with this. How does this how do we end up with anti-Semitism being one of the most deadly forms of racism, kind of falling through for the scope of racism and anti-Semitism? So sorry, I'm going to rephrase this. How do we get anti-Semitism, who is historically one of the deadliest forms of racism, not being considered as a noble form of racism in some ways? How did that happen?
Um, uh, Listen, I think Günther said actually much of it already. I mean, this whatever you want to call it, I think we have difficulty sometimes sort of finding names for it, but whether it's wokeism or critical justice theory, critical race theory, but or post-colonialism, it's basically the idea of I think it's sort of some sort of post-Marxian way in conceiving power. There are indeed on the one side the oppressed and the oppressor, um, and everything in this sense is seen through the prism of identity. So you have oppressed and oppressor, and then the prism is the identity, and universalism, liberalism goes out of the window, of course, and you end up with sort of dividing lines of power where that are seen through a lens of race, of sex, of gender, of sexuality. You have different categories of people: the black, the brown, the feminist, the gay, the trans, and somehow they intersect. And obviously the oppressed are all those, and then you have the oppressors who are the white, and in this for sort of for critical race theorists or post-colonialists, Jews are part of the general category of whites, and actually I would say they're even worse than the general category of whites, because not only are they white, but they're also Zionists. And what does Zionist mean? Zionist means racists. Zionist means colonialists in their mind. So they are sort of the ultimate weird category of evil whites, and that's I think how you can end up with people like Linda Sarsour, for example, who says that you can't be a feminist and a Zionist, or you get Jewish students on American campuses who, if they want to be part of Black Lives Matter, suddenly are forced to sign a statement where they explicitly refuse or say that they are not Zionists. And it's a weird idea of I don't know how you call it, of purism. There is sort of an urge of purity, of not having, of putting people into these strict systemic categories, and Jews in there have to be in one category, and the category they are in is the worst.
And I wonder, lest Gunther has something to add to that, which I think his previous answer spoke to Franco's question, I think, at large. But I wanted to turn to something. Like I said, there's something really interesting that I find in both of your answers that I think really helps us kind of grapple with the current forms of anti-Semitism. I mean, it seems as though even as this prejudice, this sort of sentiment takes on different colorings, it sort of manifests itself in different ways through the ages, and it's taken more of a sort of far left coloring recently, and it's got that sort of faith-based coloring that we spoke about at the start, but I wanted to go back to something Günther alluded to, which is that at bottom, on if you kind of peel off these surface level manifestations, what's at bottom of all this is the same old irrational prejudice, right? And you find many of the same irrational behavioral patterns among the anti-Semites that you found in in the Middle Ages. I mean, Günther was talking about the blood libels and whatnot. And, the fact that oftentimes the anti-Semites tend to essentialize the Jewish people as one homogeneous block, right? And once you've done that, it becomes a lot easier to, when someone makes an accusation. Centuries ago, it used to be, the Jews have killed this little boy in this village. These days, it's totally different things, but it's the same ability to kind of essentialize the group and always expect the worst intentions. And and I wonder. There's also another issue that I wanted to get to, but it's somewhat connected. So feel free to tap into both questions. It seems like since anti-Semitism does seem to have some continuity through the ages, although it takes on different colorings. I'm thinking about, for instance, Likud's rhetoric. If you look at Israeli politics, one of their main kind of driving themes is that there's always been a threat to the Jewish people through the ages, and that the state of Israel is the response to that. But even after setting up the state of Israel, the threat isn't over, and the Jewish people need to be on their heels, and they need to be alert. And it's something you may share to some extent. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to it. Certainly, if you believe in the theory of transmutation, it takes on different forms, but at heart, it's the same irrational pattern. But my question is, do you think? I mean, like Simone was saying, the Zionism and the kind of the Israeli right has in some ways perhaps made things worse in the way that we across the West see Israel. Perhaps that's a view you can take. But how do you think those two interact? I mean, is there any connection between Israeli politics and Likud and anti-Semitism? Is that what the anti-Semites have in mind, really, when they?
Well, I mean, I don't think that the anti-Semites are really concerned much about what Jews do, what they don't do. They take things usually out of context and then make that into the image that they have of Jews or the state of Israel anyway. So what I what I what I see that you're right, there is a kind of continuity over the ages. Of course, I don't believe that necessarily there has to be anti-Semitism. This is, I mean, other parts of the world have proven that this is not a necessary development, and we have seen also uh, in many parts today and in the past that it is possible not to think in anti-Semitic ways. So, but what we've seen today, I mean, the main three sources today of anti-Semitism is the are the Islamists, then the political right, far right, and the political left, and they phrase their problems. I mean, the problems they see as most urgent, um, they phrase that in a way that they then project the responsibility of why these problems cannot be solved or why these problems are so big on Jews. So if you take the radical right, a big theme today is what they call the great replacement theory. So that means the idea that um, in in Europe and in North America, the societies, white societies, are under threat because there are too many immigrants coming and replacing them. So they see that as the most important threat, and that also drifts into the populist right, by the way, and so they blame then Jews for that. So then that makes sense. This slogan in Charlottesville, "Jews will not replace us." That don't mean that actually Jews will be the majority. They mean that Jews are organizing the immigration. They're responsible for that, and that was also the rationale of the killer of Pittsburgh. That's why he thought it justified to kill praying Jews in a synagogue. because they are responsible, in his views, of bringing all the immigrants and replacing the white race. So we have these kind of ideas on the right. We have it on the left saying human rights. This is the most important thing, and who's responsible for violating all these human rights. And even in the United States, even during the summer, during this Black Lives Matter movement, there was in this movement some parts they blamed the police violence on training that some American police officers got in Israel. They said there they learned violence, so they project this. And if you look at the Islamists they think that the Islamic society's tradition and so on is under threat, and then they see the Jews behind that. So you have these projections, and this has nothing to do with actual Jewish communities or what Israel does, it doesn't. And what I think what the real danger then is in this kind of thinking, and if that drifts too much into mainstream, is that actually the problems that we do have in societies, they do not get solved. They get just projected onto Jews, and this is then an outlet for sometimes even violence against Jews. But it doesn't solve any of the problems that these societies do have. Not maybe in the form that these groups that I just described think about it, but of course we do have problems with human rights. We do have problems with integration and immigration that we need to look at, and we also maybe have to think about what ways in which people can still live in forms of living their religion in a way that fits into the modernized world, which cannot go back to the centuries earlier, where I'm now talking about the Islamic world, where there was a clear hierarchy between Muslims and non-Jews and non-Muslims. So there's no going back. So that needs to be somehow thought anew. So there are problems, but they are not tackled because it's just projected onto Jews.
I'll try and add maybe a few things. First of all, I think when you look at anti-Semitism throughout the ages, it's sort of that hate that keeps on giving, and that does indeed sort of change and change faces and change masks. But I think there are moments in history when when it appears clearer, and when it sort of it becomes violent, and I think to some extent that's why I mentioned earlier on, sort of why I think, because we are currently sort of in a crisis of our liberal democracies, that I think it is at this particular moment that anti-Semitism appears. And um, actually, I don't know if you've read it. I think it hasn't been translated yet into English, but there is a French rabbi called Delphine Orvilleur. She wrote a book about sort of anti-Semitism throughout the ages, and she looks at how the Bible, how rabbis throughout the centuries have looked and interpreted anti-Semitism. And for her, and I think I agree with her, the hatred of the Jews is sort of a reflection of the uprooted identity after the destruction of the temple by the Romans. So let me explain. The eyes of the other people for whom there is they exist as a whole, as a totality. The Jew is this weird identity that is fluid, that is in the diaspora, that is always going towards something, that is never sort of absolute, that is never entire. And so the Jew is sort of the absence, the dirty whole. And so from her perspective, and that's how what she says the rabbis have interpreted throughout the ages, that makes the Jew sort of the scapegoat sort of for the identity anxieties, for for the fears of identity in moments of crisis, when people are looking for purity and people looking to become whole again, then this weird identity of Jews that are always sort of fluid and different and not really visible makes it the perfect scapegoat. And I think this is to some extent what we are going through right now. And actually, when you look at the difference between anti-Semitism and racism, the black, the Arab is visible. You can see him. He or she is inferior to you. You hate her. The Jew is different. The Jew is invisible. The Jew is this weird thing that you don't really know whether he is or he isn't. That's why you have to put a star, a yellow star, on the jacket. It's this weird thing that you have to qualify. And so I think this is again at a moment of crisis, and there's without a doubt our societies, our liberal democracies throughout the world are going through a crisis. These identities, when people are looking to become pure, or people are looking to become whole, the Jew becomes the perfect scapegoat. So to some extent, I have to say I'm not entirely in disagreement with the Israelis who say, anti-Semitism has existed throughout the ages, and it will probably exist to some extent. Now, just one tiny little thing where I sometimes have an issue is when Israeli leaders come to France or to other places and tell European Jews that they have no place here anymore. Because, to a great extent, what we are trying to do is to try and get European governments to understand, recognize, and combat anti-Semitism. Now, when Israeli leaders come and say you don't have a place here, and at the end of the day you should come to Israel, that's obviously problematic because suddenly we are not French anymore, we're not German anymore, we're not Belgian or whatever anymore, where you become again this identity that at the end of the day should just go away. So this is what the issue where I sometimes have a problem with the Israelis, as favorable I am, and I think as important it is for Jews to know that Israel is there, and that in case of emergency, we have somewhere to go, and what fundamentally differentiates today from the 30s. At the same time, I find it problematic.
That ties in really well with what I wanted to ask to wrap this up, because there's been a lot of depressing articles on how French banlieue, but also the European suburbs, have essentially been deserted by Jews over the past decades. And many of them decide to do, not all of them, but there's a fair share who decide to do their aliyah to Israel, they decide to immigrate to Israel to become Israeli citizens. But from a pure security standpoint, it does not seem obvious to me that going to Israel would make you better off, because there's obviously a lot of terrorist attacks on a regular basis. But this makes me think that maybe there is not only a sense of physical insecurity, but maybe a larger feeling of cultural insecurity, where Jews feel that they're not just physically in danger, but also the culture around them has become threatening and unwelcoming. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, I'll start. Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the big problems is that for 10, 15, 20 years, Jews felt that there is a sort of a sense of solitude. Most Jews are passionately French, passionately German, passionately whatever, wherever they are. But when there is a feeling that, at the end of the day, they are being abandoned by the state, they are being abandoned by their fellow citizens, that, you have, the number of times I remember, whether it's in 2006, Ilan Halimi, when he was killed, where, I would look around and I would see mostly, fellow Jews marching in the streets of Paris. And we didn't have millions of people in the streets. There is a feeling of loneliness, and I have to say, what I'm probably more concerned about is not so much the aliyah, meaning not so much Jews leaving to Israel, because Jews are leaving, but they're not in masses. We're not seeing an exodus. What I'm more concerned about is the internal aliyah, meaning that Jews are leaving neighborhoods. Because simply their life has become impossible. And at the same time, the internal aliyah is also in people's minds, meaning the question that we always have is, do we have a future here? And is there sufficient, national solidarity for us as citizens or not. And I think this is very problematic.
If I may illustrate this with an anecdote, of course, I mean the harassment, physical harassment or so, is bad in some areas, but in other areas it's not so bad, and people live perfectly happy life. But one of my colleagues, when I was working in Paris, one of my academic colleagues, he told me when coming back from a trip to Israel that he would not tell anybody else from his colleagues that he went to Israel whenever he goes to Israel, because then he does not want to face all these critical questions, because he just went to visit some relatives for some family celebration and came back. And so he faced then questions when he was telling this to his academic colleagues. He was facing critical questions how he could support such an evil state by just visiting his family. So he would just not tell anybody anymore. And so you can do that for a while. You can even in sometimes maybe hide your Jewish identity, what a lot of Jews do in Europe now. They try to hide their identity. But this is not a this is not a great life usually if you have to hide who you are. So that leads to a situation that people try to find other ways how to either be in a country where they can express this freely, or to move in some areas or some circles where they can do that. So that of course adds to that. And this not taking seriously anti-Semitism, we see that from the beginning. And there was even a very early murder, Sebastian Selam, in 2003. And that was dismissed. And the murderer, he was quoted as saying by other neighbors, "I killed my neighbor, and now I go to paradise." So he was apparently influenced by some jihadist thought, but he was declared deranged. So that was then dismissed. This cannot be anti-Semitic if somebody's deranged and crazy and mad. And then this was not really addressed. And we see that more and more today, even intellectual like discussions. Whenever there is an accusation of anti-Semitism, then often it doesn't that get discussed what is the anti-Semitic content, what somebody said or not, but the accusation itself is then attacked, saying this is shutting down discourse. So we see that in Germany there was a big debate about a professor Mbembe who was not really disinvited to give a talk at a festival, because the festival was cancelled because of the pandemic. But he might have been disinvited because he said some deeply anti-Zionist and I would say anti-Semitic things. And this festival was sponsored by the government, and the government then had questions about it. But so then the debate is more not on what this person actually said, but the accusation of anti-Semitism is made as a problem. And we've seen that also in Britain for a long time. David Hirsch, he has even given that a name. He said this is the Livingston formulation, where you where you say then the problem is really that that this accusation of anti-Semitism is made, and this is made in bad faith. And when Jews accuse somebody of anti-Semitism, this is in bad faith, and that shows kind of the control, the wish for suppression that that Jews want to put on non-Jews. So this is also part of the problem that we are facing, that makes it difficult to address effectively the problems of anti-Semitism.
Well, this has been an incredibly wide-ranging discussion, and we really hope our audience will come away from it with a better understanding both of the historical kind of underpinnings of this new worrying trend, how it currently manifests itself, and how important the work of organizations like AJC, but also Günther's work on the academic sphere, how important it is that we have people doing these things so that we
So we were very lucky to have this conversation. I thought it was a fascinating conversation too. There's one concept I wanted to touch on, but we didn't quite have time, which is the idea that I borrow for Bernard-Henri Lévy. And essentially, it's the idea that when Jews are leaving neighborhoods, when Jews are leaving countries, it's bad in itself, but it's also a kind of larger, how can I say, larger signal about the way society is going. It's very much a canary in the coal mine situation. If if um, if a cannery dies, then it means that the entire atmosphere is becoming toxic. And I think there's a lot to be said about all the Jews that left the banlieue and whatnot being kind of a first signal of how radical Islam, for example, had been progressing in these neighborhoods. That's fair. That's why all the Jews had been leaving progressively. So I think that's an interesting concept you have to keep in mind. Is that anti-Semitism is awful in itself, of course, but it's also a kind of warning for larger toxic trends in a country.
Yeah, that's a really good point, it really made me think. I mean, one of the things I like the most is that when we launched the conversation, we kind of framed the rise of the rise of anti-Semitism as mostly a recent phenomenon. Simone very quickly said, "Look, if you look at a country like France, this really goes back to the early 2000s." And you were talking about BHL there, and I was watching a documentary recently that aired some years ago, but it was about, since you asked them kind of the problem in working class French neighborhoods and in like the Parisian banlieue, where you've seen like all of these working class Jewish communities either leave elsewhere, or else their kids are leaving to Israel. The documentary that I watched was about Sarcelles, where I think there's also been like several attacks, or there's been some level of violence, so it's caught attention. So I'm glad we were able to kind of point to cases where this is traces further back. And I think another point that was really interesting in the conversation was kind of exposing the the somewhat deep divisions within not Judaism, but Jewish communities worldwide themselves. I mean, Simon was also very outspoken in criticizing the Israeli right. When they just to suit their political purposes, a lot of time they campaign on pointing fingers at Europe and saying, "Look, Jews are no longer safe in Europe," and it kind of helps them politically at home to drum up fears of a kind of a global onset of anti-Semitism that is going to kind of make the state of Israel more necessary than ever. And as much as I think that is true, that we are seeing the most worrying spike in anti-Semitism really ever since the 40s. I think you have to look at these political divisions, and Jews worldwide have to come together around a shared commitment to their security, whether they live in Israel or elsewhere. And it doesn't have to run along kind of partisan lines between Likud and the more progressive share of the Jewish community worldwide. But I thought it was a really interesting conversation as well, and I think a lot of it's perhaps, out of all the ones that we've done, it's perhaps the one that is going to feel most useful, and that a lot of our audience will come out of it knowing a lot more than they did going.
Yeah, agreed. Speaking of retrospective, perfect timing here, Jorge, because this is going to be it for 2020. This is our last episode. This has been a tremendous adventure because we started our very first episode on 1st of October, and the response has been amazing. We've had plenty of reviews. We've had downloads from, I think, 55 countries across the world, from Singapore to Chile, from South Africa to South Korea. So it's been a tremendous adventure. We will be back in January. We will be back with a few surprises. I'm not going to give you that many hints, but there's going to be new ambitions, and format will be the same, but there's going to be some complementary products coming with a podcast. So keep tuned for that. We're coming back in January after Christmas break. And we hope you very much enjoy your Christmas break, and we all wish ourselves a happy new year, to be honest, after what we lived in 2020, and we can't wait to be back in 2021. So until then, see you next year.